We got one more guest, one more segment here for this February 26th edition of the show. That is with Wes Reynolds at Wes Reynolds and the number one on Twitter, regular contributor to VSiN and the Point Spread Weekly newsletter. Wes, how's it going today, man?
Well, good, Adam. How are you doing, sir?
Doing very well, buddy. It's good to chat with you here. I was on your show last night. You're on my show here this morning. So once again, thank you to you, Kelly, Brady. Great time last night on VSiN. Hopefully a lot of our listeners got a chance to check that out. Is there an archive version of the show where if they missed the segment, they can get it?
On our show, not as much because it's the evergreen show because we're doing live stuff. I will try to see if we can get that up at vsin.com for an interview. We should be able to. Usually the full show because it's oftentimes we're doing live stuff where we're updating scores in progress. So obviously that becomes stale once it's actually happened. But yeah, I will try to see if I can get that segment and find that way to the website because I think people would really enjoy listening to it. And then obviously your MLB betting guide that you have put out, and you were gracious enough to get me an advanced copy of that. And I got to tell you, from somebody that does a lot of different sports and dabbles in a little bit of everything, that's going to save people a lot of work in terms of devoting the time to this. I know baseball is kind of your first betting love. So, definitely check out your guide, man, because it will save you a lot of time. And I think it gives you such a good base without getting like overly knee deep in the weeds here. But I think it gives you a good base of knowledge going forward.
Well, no, I really appreciate that. And if you can't get the show up, everyone's just going to take my word for it. That it was the best segment ever on VSiN. But seriously, we had a good time with it. Once again, thank you to you, Brady, and Kelly for making that happen last night. And let's talk a very different market here. The XFL for week 4. We've got 3 data points now for all these teams, and I still feel like I don't really know any of them particularly well. We start here on Saturday with the first game, the Los Angeles Wildcats, 7.5-point favorites against the New York Guardians, who at this point, I think the Guardians have kind of cemented themselves as the worst team in this league.
Yeah, before we get to the individual game, you were saying even though we have 3 data points that you still feel like you don't know, it's the bookmakers that don't know either because we talked with Chuck Esposito at Sunset Station out in Henderson the other night, and he was talking about the XFL, and he's like, look, there's still a lot I don't know here in terms of what kind of action we're really seeing where they haven't figured out, okay, is it the sharps betting it or is it the public betting it? It's a little bit of both, I guess. So, that's what you're seeing with these numbers. And look, maybe it takes even over a season because the algorithms are going to be completely different, especially if you're doing in-running wagering, which most and pretty much every Vegas book is not doing that. There's a couple, I think FanDuel and PointsBet in New Jersey and in some other jurisdictions are dabbling a little bit with that in-running wagering because of the fact that there's not a lot of key numbers per se, simply because you have a lot of oddball scores with this point after where you can go for 1, 2, or 3 points. So you don't get those traditional scores on 3 and 7. But yeah, for this first game, and I took the Wildcats last week. These were 2 teams I actually split on. Took the Guardians once they got to double digits and they were never in the game, and then took the Wildcats as underdogs and they were never losing the game to DC. I think LA is a little bit of a better team. That line looks a little rich just on the road because they have that one game on the road where they got blown out at Houston. So it seems like it's a little bit of an over adjustment, but in terms of New York, look, they looked pitiful on offense for 2 weeks in a row. Matt McGloin eventually, once the game got out of hand, they took him out and put Luis Perez in, who played for Arizona in the now defunct AAF, Alliance of American Football, the week before, and he did lead them to their only touchdown. So we won't know probably until late in the week, maybe Friday, who's going to end up getting the start for this team. The principal thinks that maybe this line is a little bit of an over adjustment, but man, I really don't want the Guardians. They honestly, even though they've won a game, have looked like the worst team.
Well, and this is one of those things too, where another thing that throws a wrinkle into this league. You look at that win for the Wildcats last week. They win by 30, but they had the 4 interceptions from Cardale Jones. They only outgained DC by 54 yards. They only had one more first down. And we're getting a lot of this because the league is very inconsistent. The quarterback play is extremely inconsistent. So you have some games where the final score tells a different story than the box score. And obviously, if you get eyes on this product too, it may look a little bit different in that regard as well. So, LA, that big win last week, but it wasn't really the type of game that the final score would suggest. It's not like they moved it up and down on the DC defense all day long. Do you lay 7.5 here with that long cross-country trip? I don't know. I mean, this is a game to me. I think this one's a complete stay away. You've got a low total on this one of 39 as well. This is a game I don't really have a great pulse for the league in general, but especially this game.
Yeah, and then looking at some of the injuries, Josh Johnson, quarterback for LA, limited a little bit in practice. It looks like their receiver, Nelson Spruce, who really was probably their more consistent offensive weapon in the passing game the first couple of weeks. It's looking like as of now, he's not going to go. So, injury information, you really got to search a little bit for in terms of who's going to play and who's going to be sitting out. But, I mean, if I had to, I'd probably take New York just on the basis of that this line has gone up a little bit, and you play against the recency bias. But this may be one I either in game or just stay out of altogether.
Yeah, and I think I saw this morning too that Trey McBride is also questionable for LA. So that would be the top 2 receiving weapons for Josh Johnson. Maybe at that point the under becomes a play, but obviously here with 39, very low total in that one. How about the Dragons and the Battlehawks here? You've got the Battlehawks, a 12-point favorite against Seattle. Total on this game, 38.5. So a pretty low number here for this one. Jordan Ta'amu's been great here throughout the course of the XFL season. Didn't have to do a whole lot last week, but they're still able to get the victory there, and they're laying a very healthy number here in this one.
Yeah, you talk about an adjustment here. This St. Louis Battlehawks team, in week 1, they were taking almost 10. I think it closed maybe 9.5 in Dallas, and they get an outright win. And I know there's been 2 games played after that, but that's over a 3-touchdown adjustment in just 3 weeks in their line. And I can't necessarily argue with it because, look, the Battlehawks were the lowest priced team when you looked at the preseason in terms of the XFL, simply because I believe they had the only head coach in the league, or maybe Winston Moss had been an assistant head coach, but they had pretty much one of the only head coaches in the league that had never been a head coach, that being Jonathan Hayes, who was the tight end coach for the Cincinnati Bengals with Marvin Lewis for about 15 years. So they were the least known commodity. But this team has been the best running team in the XFL pretty much all season. And look, in this league, even though it's pass, and you want to increase the scoring, and we've kind of seen that across all levels of football, where it seems like the running game has kind of gone out with platform shoes, if you will. The running game is still important. And the teams that are able to keep defenses honest and run the ball are the teams that win games. And having Jordan Ta'amu, who's been kind of a threat not only through the air, but especially running the football, they've been able to do that. Kind of a brave new world here, even though we had the Battlehawks laying 10 last week, and they easily covered against New York. So you see a little bit of the adjustment upwards. Seattle was in the game with Dallas, and then Dallas kind of did what they did to LA the week before, where they wore them out in the second half with the running game. They still were able to throw the ball down the field with Landry Jones, but they were able to get Cameron Artis-Payne and Lance Dunbar going and wore LA out. And then St. Louis kind of does the same thing with their running game.
This is one where I guess I'm kind of looking a little bit towards the over here. I think Brandon Silvers looked a lot better last week, certainly a little bit healthier than he was in that week 2 start. And, the Guardians did move the football a little bit on this Battlehawks team last week. It's one of those things where for the Guardians, I mean, look, they've got Matt McGloin. They've got some guys that have some upside, maybe more upside than what's there for Seattle. But, this is a Guardians team that last week had 5.6 yards per play. So they were able to move it to a degree anyway. So I think the over is probably the way I'd look here, especially with that low total, 38.5. I know that obviously you've got a Battlehawks team that does run it quite a bit, but they do move it in chunks when they run it. And they're getting some positive plays. They're staying ahead of the chains. Maybe this one gets some points for us there on Saturday.
Yeah, and just as kind of a general rule, I might be wanting to start looking at more overs than unders, because we have seen, obviously, in terms of week 3, I believe with 12 games played, it's like 8-4 to the under. It was 2 for 2 last week, so we started to see the scoring pick up at least a little bit in spots, and I think you're going to see that now. I mean, look, the openers, they didn't know what to do with them because they didn't have any data, so they put them out 40.5. Bettors bet them over into the 50s. They bet them up too high, over adjustment, and then the unders came in the second week in a row. So now all of a sudden those totals got pushed into kind of on average, the mid 40 range. So now kind of where they are, and you're seeing them even in the high 30s, just below 40 in a couple of these games. Now is where I think you might get some pushback here on the overs, just by and large going forward.
So we moved to Sunday here for the Lone Star State battle, Houston and Dallas. And Wes, I got to say, if you would have told me going into the first season here at the XFL that Landry Jones would be a home underdog in any situation, I probably would have laughed at you. But that is the case here this week. Houston favored by 2 on the road at Dallas.
And Landry Jones, look, you've kind of seen the best and the worst of him a little bit in this league. He looked like he's been enjoying some Whataburgers down there in Texas. Maybe not in the greatest physical shape, but he can throw the ball down the field. I mean, he's thrown a few dimes in these first 2 games. And obviously with the air raid offense that Hal Mummy and Bob Stoops are kind of running together here, they're throwing the ball very well down the field. Now, he does, I believe, have 4 interceptions in his 2 starts. He did not go in week 1, mind you, against St. Louis, a home loss there. But he's thrown 2 interceptions in back-to-back games. Now, he threw 3 touchdowns and 73% completion, 274 yards. And then Dallas did the same thing last week at Seattle that they did at LA the week before, which has got the running game going a little bit in the second half. And I think that ended up being the difference in the game. But I want to take Dallas here, but I want a little bit more. I would like, even though they're not as defined of a key number as you would get even in college football and more in the NFL, I would like to get 3 if I possibly can. Roughnecks, clearly through 3 weeks, look like the best team in the XFL. They went punch for punch, and credit Tampa Bay. They went punch for punch with them, and Houston found a way at the end and got that big interception, that big turnover from Taylor Cornelius to basically salt away the game. But Houston, I think, has probably looked the most ready to play, where I think combination of players and coaching with June Jones have really kind of gotten this league, I think, quicker than a lot of their competitors in the league. So Houston's clearly the best team. I want to take Dallas, but I do want to wait and see if I can get a little bit more.
Yeah, and maybe if you're lucky enough to have a book that offers the derivative options here, Houston first half, Dallas second half, something like that, does make some sense here. I mean, Dallas scored on 4 of their 5 possessions last week. And like you said, they were kind of able to put that game away. For Houston, 7.9 yards per play last week. And, when you look at that performance against the Vipers, it looks like it was a closer game than it actually was, because Tampa Bay ran 23 more plays. So, it's not like Houston's defense was great in that game necessarily, but they were out there for a much heavier workload because the offense just moved it in such explosive fashion that Tampa Bay was able to run a lot more plays. So interesting game, maybe a game that we'll see again down the line here for maybe a little bit more. But again, it's one of those situations where I think you've got a Houston team that's looked so good, a Dallas team that a lot of people thought had the most upside coming into the year. maybe it is a spot to take the dog. But like I said, I think first half Houston, second half Dallas, if you're lucky enough to have that opportunity.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that option.
All right, one more game to talk about here in the XFL, and can't really say too much about this one because we don't have a line for it right now because we're not sure what's going to happen with the Vipers quarterback situation and Aaron Murray. There was a report that Aaron Murray would come back from that shoulder injury. Mark Trestman responded to that report and said that it didn't come from him. He didn't know what they were talking about. So this one between DC and Tampa Bay looks like it's pretty much off the board across the market.
Yeah, Aaron Murray, it has come out that he is at least taking first-team reps in practice today. Quentin Flowers, by the way, not practicing for the Tampa Bay Vipers. But look, I thought Taylor Cornelius, I mean, he wasn't great, but I didn't think he was bad. It looked like that they were going to go with Quentin Flowers in the second half, but they went ahead and kept Taylor Cornelius. It proved to be the right decision as he led them down the field. Did have that interception late, which pretty much took Tampa Bay out of contention. But Cornelius was able to run the ball a little bit because Quentin Flowers, I think, I would think was their best option from an RPO standpoint, where it's not really a luxury. I think it's almost becoming a necessity in this league. And Ben Kirchhoff of CBS Sports, who covers the XFL, kind of agreed with that assessment that, look, this is a league, I think, conducive to a quarterback that's able to run and not just be your traditional pocket passer. And Taylor Cornelius showed that he could do that a little bit last week against Houston, and also ran for a touchdown, much like Quentin Flowers also did. But they used Flowers a lot in maybe or mostly really the second quarter, and then they went with Cornelius the entire second half. And look, Tampa Bay did go punch for punch with Houston, and I think in the situation, just on the sense of urgency, being 0-3, if you lose this game, you are pretty much done because the top two teams in the two respective conferences are what are going to be your playoff teams, four playoff teams here. So, if you're Tampa Bay, you can't go 0-4 and probably have any chance to make the playoffs. But the quarterback situation is a mystery. I didn't like what I saw out of Aaron Murray in week one. I thought he left points off the board. He made 2 turnovers in the red zone. Now that's just one game. Maybe you give him another shot here. So I have to trust that coaching staff down there that they're going to KYP, know their personnel before better than all of us will. But Aaron Murray didn't really dazzle me in week one.
Getting today's show out just a little bit late here. So as we transition over to the college basketball side, got a couple of games in the Big Ten tonight, but I just want to focus on the late one here between Maryland and Minnesota. I wrote up a preview for this game over at BangTheBook.com, so you get my thoughts over in that piece. But, Wes, at this time of the year in college basketball, it's always interesting to read the market. I know you were talking about this game last night on VSiN, the NC State-North Carolina game. North Carolina 3-13 in conference play. Short favorite over an NC State team with everything to gain from its NCAA tournament hopes, and North Carolina wins that game. Tonight, you've got a 500 Minnesota team in a coin flip game against the top team in the Big Ten, at least from a conference record standpoint, in Maryland. This is another one of those lines that kind of smells a little fishy.
Yeah, and we talked on the Green Zone not only on Sunday but on Monday about that last night's North Carolina State and North Carolina game, and I'll kind of compare it to this one where this is the stinky line, and I ended up being on North Carolina, and I said, look, NC State, one of the last 4 in, and if you believe in all the bracketologies, and yet they're getting points at a North Carolina team that have lost 7 in a row. This stinks to high heaven, but sometimes you got to go where the stink is. I mean, this stink here might be stank, if you want to call it that, with Maryland and Minnesota, because you got a Minnesota team that is 500 overall, 13-13, would not be in the NCAA tournament today, but because they're in the Big Ten, and you'll hear this often, you get a lot of opportunities in terms of getting wins and maybe getting you on the right side of the bubble. Now, I think Minnesota would probably have to win out and at least win a game in the Big Ten tournament in Indianapolis to even have a sniff of that. But You got a Maryland team that 22-5. I know they lost at Ohio State on Sunday, but this is a team that I think pretty much consensus would be on the 2 line in terms of being an NCAA tournament seed. Probably getting a number 1 for the Big Ten is a little bit out of the question this year, but as these teams lose, you never know. But Maryland, I think, would be at least a solid 2, maybe a 3 at this point. And yet it's a pick 'em, and even in some spots they're getting a point. So maybe this is the Gophers' last stand here in this game, where it's like they're sitting on a good effort, and we'll see if they have stayed with the season going forward and haven't gotten too discouraged being 500 at this point overall, and probably would be, I think they'd be about an 11 or a 12 seed in the Big Ten tournament going to Indianapolis, but I don't know. Maybe the odds maker is telling us that they think Minnesota's got a shot here.
Yeah, and as I compared these two teams side by side for the article, I mean, they're very similar. Neither one of these teams shoots it very well. Neither one of these teams forces a lot of turnovers on defense. Their adjusted offensive efficiency numbers over at places like Torvik and KenPom are by and large because they take care of the basketball on offense and they play a good schedule. I mean, if you look at these two teams statistically, they are not that much different. It's just that Maryland's got a lot more wins, and maybe they just have the higher upside. Maybe they're just a little bit more consistent of a team. But I think this line kind of speaks to the fact that these statistical profiles of these two teams are not that far apart, but their records are. And again, this is a line that definitely caught my eye as I was looking at it. And this won't be the last game like this over the last couple of weeks of the regular season. That's for sure.
Yeah, you wouldn't think so. And to look at this and to say that, clearly Maryland's better because you look at that record, but they are fairly similar statistically. I think Minnesota is a little bit better than this 13-13 record. I think they've had some close losses this year, so they haven't exactly had a lot of luck in that regard. And if you look at them in terms of the power ratings, most people would probably have them as a top 40 team at least, even though they're 500. So look, the Big Ten's a tough league this year. Minnesota got off to a tough start in the non-conference season, started out 3-4. None of them were really bad losses though. So I'm going to lean with the Gophers here, but I got to look at this a little more.
Yeah, I took Maryland, I think, but it's not one that I had a bet on. I just thought it was a really interesting game to wind up talking about, much like we did here on today's show. But one more item of business, Wes, and that is the PGA Tour. As the California swing is over, now we go out to Florida at PGA National for the Honda Classic. Not an awesome field here, a decent field. Fleetwood, your favorite, Koepka, Fowler, who's won this before. You've got Louis Oosthuizen, Billy Horschel's in pretty good form, Gary Woodland, Justin Rose, guys like that. First and foremost, tell us about this course and what you're kind of looking for in terms of the players that you took.
Yeah, this is an okay field, but if you looked at advance to next week, the field at Bay Hill is much better and much more stacked. And I just think that this event may suffer a little bit in the fact that you have such a condensed schedule now in the Florida swing, with the Players' Championship being moved back to March, with the PGA now being held in May instead of in July or early August. So this was an interesting field, the fact that the 3 shortest priced guys, the 3 favorites on the board, Tommy Fleetwood, Brooks Koepka, Ricky Fowler, have all had tournaments where they played well here. Ricky Fowler, in fact, won it a couple years ago, and he and Brooks Koepka were co-runner-ups last year. But this looked like a week where you could take a stand against the favorites, which I'm going to do more often than not, but especially this week. You just don't have the form with these guys. This is a PGA National Champions course in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. Jack Nicklaus did the redesign. It's a 7,100-yard par 70, but it's actually the toughest par 70 on the tour. And if you look at the difficulty rank, 4 of the last 5 years, it's been one of the top 5 most difficult courses on tour. There were only 4 courses and 4 events that had tougher courses last year. Bethpage Black at the PGA, Pebble Beach at the U.S. Open, Sheshan, which is over in China, for the WGC, HSBC, a lot of letters and abbreviations there, champions, and Royal Portrush at the Open Championship. Those were the only more difficult courses than this one last year. So you rarely see the average winning score since they moved this event over here back in 2007. The average winning score is minus 8.8 under par. So you are going to more than likely have single digits under par win this event.
So when you get a course like that, I mean, do you sort of, take a look at the best of the best? Do you look at the ball strikers, or do you sort of, kind of maybe look for guys that, maybe are a little bit higher variance to where maybe, they come out here and play really well in this one? Are you looking for putters? What are you kind of looking for?
It's a little bit of a crapshoot in this event. I mean, I think you got to look for guys that keep the ball in play. Accuracy usually is not the most important from week to week, but you got to look for guys that are going to keep the ball in the fairway. You got to look for guys, greens in regulation, just a good solid tee to green game. They started doing this strokes gained measurement metrics about 4 seasons ago. So that's all the data we have. But of the last 4 winners in this event, they've ranked, and I'll go from 2019 backwards, first, 10th, and 3rd in tee to green for that particular week in strokes gained tee to green. So, you want guys that are going to be able to avoid bogeys. There's a lot of holes here where you basically are playing for par, and that's the best that you're going to get. And you know what? You'll take 15 or 16 pars and see if you can shoot 2 under par. If you shoot 468s basically, which is 2 under par each round, 8 under on a Sunday, you're going to be right in the mix to win the thing. So, those are the guys I think you're looking for.
So who are those guys that are on your list this week?
Yeah, I went with a couple guys kind of in the mid 20 to 30 range to start off. Gary Woodland and Billy Horschel. Gary Woodland leads the field actually in ball striking, and the way the PGA Tour measures the ball striking is greens in regulation combined with total driving. So Woodland is a guy, comes back to Florida, hasn't won since the U.S. Open, but has played solid, hitting the ball really well. Billy Horschel, I actually got in the mid-30s, and now he's down to like about 25. Back-to-back top 10s from Phoenix last week, or a couple weeks ago, and then at the WGC Mexico. So he's playing solid. Shane Lowry, you'll get a lot of the Europeans now are coming over as you're getting to the Florida swing, and as we're about a month out from the Masters. Shane Lowry, I got at 45-1. Doesn't have much of a record here at this course, but if the wind starts blowing, he's a pretty good player in windy conditions, as we saw at Royal Portrush last year for the Open Championship. 4th in this week's field in terms of bogey avoidance. So this is a guy that plays this kind of grinder game where he's able to grind out pars. I think he's certainly a guy to look at. I came down to a couple Georgia Bulldogs in that 70-1 range. Harris English or Russell Henley, a former winner here. Harris English is who I went with. 2nd on the tour in greens and regulation, 1st in bogey avoidance, 5th in ball striking, back on the Bermuda greens. So a lot of these guys like this Florida swing because they get on that Bermuda that they've putted on all their life. Corey Connors, same guy, 75-1. One of the better ball strikers on tour. Not a great putter, but he's less bad, I guess, if you want to say, on Bermuda green. So he's a guy I looked at. And then a couple longer shots. Matt Nesmith, 100-1, who won the Korn Ferry Tour Finals last fall to earn his PGA Tour card. Now made 7 straight cuts, and he's had his back-to-back events, his best 2 finishes on his short career on the PGA Tour. Tied for 11th at Pebble, tied for 6th last week in Puerto Rico. And then Doc Redman, 225-1. Maybe he'll be like Keith Mitchell was for me last year, who eventually got home and held off Brooks captain Ricky Fowler, and he's at about the same price, 225-1. Really accurate driver, really good ball striker, greens and regulation. So it is a little bit of a crapshoot this week in terms of putting together a staking plan, but that was basically by default what I did, is just getting accurate drivers and guys that put it in the fairway and guys that can reach the greens.
Always great to chat with Wes Reynolds here on the show at Wes Reynolds #1 on Twitter. Wes, as I mentioned, regular contributor to VSiN and that Point Spread Weekly newsletter. When can people find your work?
Okay, Friday night, be back on the air from 6 to 10 Pacific. And then over the weekend, I do some XFL Betcast stuff, which you can go to vsin.com for more information on that. And then Green Zone Monday and Tuesday from 6 to 10 Pacific. Sunday will also be on that particular program from 3 to 7 Pacific. And then our golf show, Long Shots, came back last month. So we air that from 5 to 6 Pacific time, where Brady and Cannon and I break down the PGA Tour events, even maybe do a little European tour, and basically talk an hour of golf on VSiN.
Well, there you go. Make sure you check all that out. And, of course, like I said, make sure you follow Wes on Twitter at Wes Reynolds and the #1. Wes, appreciate your time as always, man. Thank you so much for joining me. We'll talk to you again next week.
You got it, Adam. Thanks for having me as always.